the purpose of this week is introduction to the concept of the database. What is the database, and how is different from the Excel and so on, right? So by end of this week, we want to learn the meanings that you see in this graph, right? So today, we want to discuss the meaning of this table. What is the meaning of this, right? So that's the purpose of this week. So let's dive into this topic. So I'm going to do some introduction and some terms that we need to define. For example, what is data and what is information? So the data is anything that it is meaningful. For example, name of the students. For example, name of the products, price of the products, the date that we purchased the product, and so on. So those are the ones that we store, and they have some meanings for us, right? So basically, data is the stored representation of the meaningful objects or events, right? So they have some meanings for us. Now, data could be in two formats: structured versus unstructured. So unstructured one are image, video, map, and documents. So these are the ones that they are very difficult to analyze, and we are not going to work on this one. We work on the structured one, that is number, text, or dates, right? So these are the ones that we are going to focus. Now, what is the difference between data and information? So data, when you process the data, you get some insight or knowledge about the data that you have. So that knowledge is called information. So basically, when you process the data, you get some insight. So that insight is information. The definition of the database is organized collection of the data. So we organize the data using something that it is called model or data model. So data model is the way that the data is moving inside of the organization, right? So let me give you an example. So here we have two columns. One of them is names, like Baker Kenneth, for example, and then numbers. So when you look at this one, you might think this is a names, but this numbers doesn't make much sense, right? It could be social security numbers, or could be campus-wide ID, or anything, or you might have other guesses as well. Now, let me give more information. Now, here you can see it is a class, it's a class roster, right? So it is the name of the students. The first column was the name of the students. The second was their campus-wide ID, and then their major and GPA, right? So their name is a text, their ID is a number, their major is a 3 or 4 character letters, and their GPA is a number, right? So that's now make more sense, right? Now, there are other definitions for the information as well, that, for example, process data, knowledge derived from data, and so on, right? Now, another term that it is very important here, it is called metadata. So if you recall in the previous graph, here we had the name, and here we define that name. For example, name, it is an alphanumeric type, and it is length, it is 30. At max, you can put 30 characters, right? And it represents a student's name, right? So it is name is a student. Then the same thing for the ID, major, and GPA. For example, GPA is a decimal, it length is 3, the minimum is 0, the maximum is 4, right? So these are the one. And it shows the average of basically GPA of students, right? Now, let me give you a history of the database. So the story is that at the beginning, after computers were common in the industry, we used to have every unit, every organizational unit, they had a system. So their system was separate. It was designed for the needs of the specific units. For example, for payroll, they had one system. For accounting, they had another one. For ordering, they had another one. And the issue was that these systems, they were separated. There were no interconnection or sharing a data between this one. So this one had a lot of disadvantages, including data redundancy or duplication of the data, limited data sharing, and so on. So they came up with a good idea. It is called database. So the database was, they had a central database that has all the data that they needed, and they use one system that it is called database management system, or DBMS, right? So they implemented this. So the way it was, they had the central database that has all the information, all the data that we need, including the employees, orders, and so on. And then database management is the one that has access to the data. Then other systems, they're connected to the database management system, and then they can update the database, right? So that's how it works. So database management system was a software system that it is used to handle and access to the database. So they're controlling the database, and they are basically changing, adding, deleting, all of kind of data, right? Okay. Now we are slowly moving to the details of the database. So the database starts with data model. So what is the data model? It is a graphical graph that shows how data moves in the organization, right? So we have two categories. One is called enterprise data model, and the other one is project. So enterprise is very general and high level data, but project data is more detailed. Let me give you an example. So here we have enterprise data model. So here, for example, you see a box, right? So inside of this box is there is a name, right? So for example, for this one is customer, for this one we have order, and this one is product. So this data model that we see here, it shows that the customers, they place orders, and the orders, they have products, right? They contain orders, right? And there are some other signs that we are going to introduce later. Now, when you add more details, you're going to get the project data model. Now, we want to focus and learn what is the meaning of these boxes and these writings that we have inside of this table. So that's the purpose of the rest of the meeting. So these boxes, they are called entity, right? So what is entity? So entity is the something that the organization, they want to store and follow the data, right? So entity is something that they want to follow. So entity could be a person, it could be an object, it could be a place, and so on. So entity is the interest of the organization that they want to follow and track it. So usually it is represented by this shape. So it is, for example, here, customers, orders, and products, they are entities. The same thing here, right? So products, order line, and so on, they are entities, right? So these boxes, they are entities. Now, this customer is entity that we are interested in. Now, this customer has some details, right? So here, customer name, and so on. So this details is called attributes, right? So attributes are properties of this entities, right? So attributes, right? So the attributes are the property. For example, order has order ID, customer ID, and order date. Product has product ID, standard price, and so on, right? Okay, so this box is called entity. Now, the one that has one line is called strong. So strong entity means that we have to have it in system because it is necessary. But we have two other type of the entities that we are going to come back and discuss later. Okay. So let's first focus on entity. So entity is the noun that it is describing a person, place, object, event, or concept, right? And they should have attributes, right? So example of the person is student, employee, customer, and so on. Place could be store, warehouse, and so on. And object could be machine, building, car, and so on, right? So you can see example of this. So here you can easily identify the customer is entity, right? Orders is entity, right? So products are entity and employees are entity. Customer and employees, they are person, right? Product is object, right? So these are example of entities, right? And then here we have customer ID, customer first name, customer last name, street address, and so on. They are attributes. Now let's focus on this term. What is the meaning of this PK? So this PK means primary. It is a primary key, right? So primary key. Okay. So if you look at your campus-wide ID, it is very important number, right? So whenever you go to any office on campus, the first question that they ask is, what is your campus-wide ID, right? So when they have your campus-wide ID, they can easily find your details. For example, your first name, your last name, what is your major, and so on, right? So here, your campus-wide ID is a primary key. It is one attribute that it is important, and we can identify one student out of all of the students, right? So the same thing for the customer ID. It is the primary key. It helps us to identify one customer out of all of the customers. So primary key is helping us to identify one individual out of many individuals that we have, right? So primary key is one attribute, sometimes combination of the attributes that helps us to identify one individual out of entire entities, right? Okay, makes sense. So identifier or primary key is the one that helps us to identify one individual. Okay, now their attributes, they have multiple types. Their classification is multiple. So one is the required. So that means you need to provide value for this one versus optional. So that means you can provide value. Sometimes it is not required. If you want, you can provide value. Otherwise, it's not required. Now, let's look at this one. For example, here is the attributes that we have: student ID, name, address, and so on. And then here you have two examples, right? So this is example number one, and this is example number two, right? So this is one student, this one is another one. And you can see this one has a major, but this one doesn't, right? So this one is optional option, right? So the term instance means sample of the data, right? So student, one example, one row of the table is called instance, okay? So these are another term that we need to know. Instance is one row of table. Okay, so this was required versus optional. So optional means that if you want, you can provide the data, otherwise is not required. Okay. Now, we have another example, another data type, another type of the attributes is that composite, like address. You can break it down the composite attributes into smaller attributes that still make sense. For example, address, you can break it down to the street address, city, state, zip code, and so on, right? So those are all make sense, right? So that's called composite. Now, there is another one that it is called multi-valued. Even though it's close, they are very different. So multi-valued is like scale, right? So you see that it is curly bracket, right? So it is, so scale could be, for example, accounting, could be marketing, could be programming, right? So, but they are different from composite, right? So multi-valued and composite, they are different. Now we have another data attribute type that it is called derived. So you do some calculation and you get that. So for example, you have date of birth. So this is the original column. And then you calculate the age. So this age is derived. So this is a derived attribute. So far we are just talking about attributes and the type of attributes. Now let's go back to that graph. So this PK makes sense. Okay. So what is this CPK? Now you can guess PK is a primary key. Now what is the meaning of the C? So sometimes the primary key can be composite. So what does it mean? It is a combination of attributes, right? So instead of just one attribute, we use multiple attributes. So this C stands for composite, right? So it is a composite primary key. Okay, so CPK stands for composite primary key. Okay, so here in the table of orders, you just need to have order number, but in the order details, you need to have product number and order number and product number in order to find one row of this table. So that's the meaning of the CPK, okay? Primary key is the one that helps us to identify a person or object, right? And it cannot be null. So what is the meaning of the null? Null means empty or unknown. So empty or unknown, we cannot leave the primary key empty. That's the reason. For example, we cannot have a student that doesn't have campus-wide ID. We definitely need campus-wide ID for the student. Now, there are some requirements for the identifier. For example, it cannot change value, it cannot be null, and so on. So you just all right. Now, we talked about most of this graph, except you see there are some signs that it doesn't make, we have not introduced it yet. So let me first discuss this. Now, okay. So let's say I have author. So this is and books. Okay. So I have two entities here, authors and books, right? So sometimes one author can write multiple books, right? And sometimes books are written by multiple authors. Now, I want to show what is the relation of these two, right? So this is the table of authors. For example, author has author ID, right? So this becomes author ID. And then it has author name, right? And so on, right? So I just have two columns here. And then let's say the books has the book ID and has book name, right? So these are the attributes that we just focused. Okay. Now, then let's say I have author ID as well here, right? So book ID, book name, and for time being, just remember this is author ID, right? Okay. So sometimes one author, for example, let's say book ID 10 is written by author ID number 1. Book 11 is written by author number 1. Book 12 is written by author number 2, right? So here you can see one author can write multiple books, right? So I want to show what is the relationship between this one. So here I have a detail of the authors, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And then here I show which book is written by which author. So I need to show the way this table works. Now I use two special signs. So this one means 1. So this means the meaning of this is 1. The meaning of this one is anything more than 1, right? So 1, 2, 3, and so on. Right? So this sign means many. Okay. Now, when I do this one for this table, so let me. So let's say I have such a relationship, right? So this means one author can write many books, right? So author can write many books. So when I'm reading from the left to right, I pay attention to this one. So author writes many books, but when I read from the right to left, I pay attention to this one. And the meaning of this one is 1, right? So each book is written by one author, right? Does it make sense? So here, I'm representing the relation between the author and books. So each author writes many books and each book is written by one author. Does it make sense so far? So this is called one-to-many relationship, okay? Now, look at this, the AID, the author ID. So I'm using this one to make the connection between the table of the books and author. So this author ID, it is available here as a primary key. Now I'm using that one in another table and to find the detail of the author. So this column here becomes foreign key. So the term foreign key, so here FK stands for foreign key, right? So FK is foreign key. Okay, so FK stands for foreign key. Now you can see the example here. For example, here we have customer ID, and then here you have customer ID. So for example, you can easily identify, for example, order 1001. is placed by customer ID 1, right? So this not 1, it shows to find the detail of this customer, you can go back to the table of customers and find the detail of this customer, right? So that's the way that you can make the connection between tables, right? So here it shows which customer placed which order. Okay, so let's continue on this one. So we talked about this means 1. So this hash sign means 1. This one means many. Sometimes you might see this one as M as well. So 1, okay? Now, when you look at here, there is a strange sign as well, okay? So let's all discuss all. So we might have this way, we might have this way, we might have this way, we might have this one. Okay. So the second signs that you see here, we already discussed this one. So they represent 1, right? 1 and many. Right? Okay. Now the first sign that I added in front of them, hatch sign means mandatory. Okay, so hatch sign is mandatory. The circle one is optional. Okay, so let me go back and click. So this circle means optional many. So what is the meaning of this optional? So optional means I may have a customer that has a 0 order. So optional means the minimum is 0. But I may have other customers that they placed hundreds of the order, right? So optional many means that the minimum is 0. Okay. So optional many, this is called optional many, means that my customer could be 0 order. It might have, we might have a customer with 0 order. We might have another customer that has hundreds order. Now, mandatory 1. So mandatory 1 means that each order, it belongs to one and only one customer, right? So for example, custom order number 1001, it just belongs to one customer. It doesn't belong to more than one, right? So this is many. So we talked about one to many. We have other types of the relationships as well. For example, one to one. So for example, here we might just allow each customer place one order. For example, there is a limit on the inventory and we just want to limit the number of the orders of the customers to 1, for example, right? So we just say 1 to 1 customer can place 1 order. So it's called 1 to 1. Sometimes we might have many to many orders. So many to many relationships. So both sides are called many to many, right? So, and you can see none of this many to many doesn't happens here. So I'm going to explain why that doesn't happen in a minute. Okay. So let's recap. So each of these box called entity. The detail inside is called attribute. One of the attribute is the most important one, and we call it primary key. Attribute entities they represent a table, right? So these customers can be translated to the table, that these attributes are the columns of this table, right? Now, these tables, they are related to the other tables. We are representing some strange sign, like this one is called mandatory 1, and this one is called optional many. So the meaning of this one is that each customer may place many orders, but each order belongs to one and only one customer. So that's the meaning of this. Now, we relate each of these orders to a specific customer, for example, by putting them in the other table as a foreign key. So FK stands for foreign key, and it is helping us to track back the information. For example, if you say order 1000 is placed by customer number 1, you can find the detail of this customer from the table of customers. The same thing for the employees. If you know the ID of this employee that's working on a specific order, you can track back the detail of this customer from the table of employees, right? Okay, so the CPK stands for composite primary key. So as I just mentioned earlier, there is no many-to-many relationship here, and you're not going to see, in fact, in any of these tables here. So if you look at this carefully, you will not see any many-to-many relationship in any of this database. So what happens? Why we don't have such a thing? To understand that, let's go back to this one. Okay, so here we have many-to-many relationship, right? So we have employees and courses. And employees, they take a course and they get certificate. Now, that's is this kind of relationship, many-to-many relationship, they need to go through a process that's called editing or normalization process. So we get rid of the many-to-many relationship by adding a new table. So here we add a new table here. This is called linkage table or associative entity. So this is called associative entity. Now, this many-to-many relationship is broken down to two one-to-many, right? So here we had many-to-many. So pay attention to the A. So it's copied here. This B is here, right? So we get two one-to-many relationship, right? So many-to-many at the beginning is broken down to two one-to-many, right? So here you have two options for the table that you create in the between, the linkage table. You either create artificial primary key, so something made up, so the way that here it is made, or, so this is option number 1. So option number 2 is that you copy the primary key, for example, employee ID and course ID, and use it as a composite primary key, right? So this is option number 2. Both of them are correct. So either way is right. So composite primary key based on the employee ID and course ID, or you can create the primary key itself. Now, let's go and try to find this kind of stuff in the database that I just showed you. Now look at this table, the table of order details. So you see here order number and product numbers. Now let's look at the order number. So order number is a primary key in this table, and the product number is a primary key in this table as well. And you can see we copied both of this and using it as a composite primary key. So the textbook uses this one. So order details, so the order and products, at the beginning, the relationship was many-to-many, right? But we added the linkage table. The name of the linkage table is order details, on order underscore details, and it has composite primary key. So the textbook uses this one. Now you can see products and vendors, they have the same situation, right? So product and vendors, they had the many to many relationship. That means one product could be offered by many vendors, and each vendor, they were offering many products. Now here we break down the many-to-many relationship, and we created the linkage table of the product vendors, and here it is the composite primary key of this table. Okay. So this type of the database that we have, it is called relational database. So it's called relational database. So DB stands for database. Okay, so these entities, so at the beginning, we identify entities and the relation of the entities, and we graph them. So that the result of that, it becomes entity relationship diagram, right? So we call it ERD. So E stands for entity, R stands for relationship, and D stands for diagrams, right? Then we do some editing or called normalization that we are going to talk in the next session, which is, topic of chapter 2. Then we get this thing, right? So whatever you see in this, it is called relational, right? So it's called the relation database, okay? When we have the relational database, each of these boxes, they are translated directly to the tables. The columns of the tables are this. This is the name of the table. And then you just add the rows to the tables.